David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, I've got to start today by revising a previous analysis that I've made. I now believe that it is possible, but it is still going to be an uphill battle for Democrats to take control of the Senate in 2020. Really good post about this on our subreddit from user HomieAlex7. And Homie Alex is completely right. The reality has changed, so our analysis has to change. So if you've heard me talk about this previously, I've said that there is a very real chance of removing Donald Trump from the White House in 2020. That's the presidential election. That in the House of Representatives, where Democrats currently have control, there is a very real chance that Democrats could extend their majority above and beyond where it is now. But I said that when you look at the Senate and you look at the seats that are up for re-election in 2020, that it didn't seem plausible that Democrats could take control of the Senate. And really, we'd be looking at 2022 as the first serious opportunity where Democrats could take control of the Senate. But the good news, if you want Democrats to take control, is that there are now some specific races that have changed where it is still an uphill battle, but Democrats can take control of the Senate in 2020. So we're going to get into exactly what races these are, and we'll do the analysis. And then really after we do the case by case, the race by race analysis as it may be, it'll be important to do sort of a more overarching step back look at it, because a lot of times it's not about individual races, it's about the general way that the election will go. So quickly catching up, there are 100 seats in the Senate, 2 per state. There are 6-year terms in the Senate. Every 2 years, about a third of those 100 seats are up for election. Next November, Class 2, they have classes 1, 2, and 3, splitting the 100 seats up into 3 classes. Class 2 is up for re-election. That's 33 seats. And then in addition to those 33 seats, there are 2 special elections. One is in Arizona to fill the vacancy left by the death of Republican Senator John McCain. There is also a special election in Georgia because Senator Johnny Isakson, who's also a Republican, is resigning at the end of this year. So of the total 35 seats that are up in 2020, Republicans have 23 seats to defend, and Democrats have 12 seats to defend. Many of the Democratic seats are safe for Democrats. Massachusetts, for example, Oregon is another one. Many of the Republican seats are equally safe for Republicans, like Louisiana and Montana, for example. But the balance of power often ends up depending on a small number of races. And there is now a path that is not an outrageous one for Democrats to take the Senate. So right now, the 116th Congress, Republicans have 53 seats. Democrats have 45 plus 2 independents that tend to caucus with them. It's Bernie Sanders and I believe it's Angus King. 53 to 47, effectively, Democrats needing 4 net seats to take over control, putting them at 51 and Republicans at 49. The other scenario is that if Democrats take the White House, the vice president becomes the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, meaning Democrats could have a net gain of 3. That would make it 50-50. And then the vice president, who would presumably be a Democrat if Donald Trump is defeated, would become the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. That's another scenario. So first things first, before we look at what seats Democrats could take from Republicans, are there any current Democratic seats that could be lost or are likely to be lost to Republicans? And the answer is yes, there are. The one that comes to mind is Doug Jones in Alabama. Right now, this one is likely to be lost to a Republican. Doug Jones defeated Roy Moore, the serial accused child sex assaulter, in a special election down in Alabama at the end of 2017. If indeed Doug Jones is defeated, and he could win, but the polling doesn't look good for Doug, that would mean Democrats need to take back 5 seats in order to net a gain of 4, or 4 plus winning the White House to have the tiebreaker. So are there 4 or 5 seats that Democrats could take from Republicans? And the answer is that yes, they are. In no particular order, Colorado is currently held by Republican Cory Gardner. We have former presidential candidate John Hickenlooper, who's running there. He's up, according to the latest poll I found, by 13 points. That's one seat that is likely to go from Republicans to Democrats. Seat number 2, this is one of the ones that's changed recently. Susan Collins, because I believe, at least partially, her loud support for Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, Susan Collins in Maine could be defeated now. She is losing popularity. She's still doing well in the Senate polls, but she could lose. This is one where the ground game is what will determine what happens, but it's potentially winnable, and it's more winnable than it's been in a long time. Susan Collins has been in that seat since 1997. That's 22 years, and this is probably her most vulnerable re-election campaign yet. That would be seat number 2. Number 3, Arizona. There's that special election in Arizona for John McCain's seat. Martha McSally was appointed there. She has not won an election. Astronaut Mark Kelly is running against her. In a recent poll, Mark Kelly is +2 over Martha McSally. The prior poll had him even. It's close, but he's in it. That would be seat number 3. Number 4, now we're getting a little more speculative. Tom Tilling in North Carolina. Tillis. This is definitely one that is a bit more of a stretch. The polling still has Tillis ahead by about 3, but he's not super popular. And North Carolina is a place where we have seen Republicans move away from approving of the job that Trump is doing more than in many other places, which means that it could be winnable in North Carolina. That's 4 seats. And then number 5 is Iowa. Absolute total lunatic Republican Joni Ernst is still polling +2 or 3 in Iowa. Her popularity is down significantly. She's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, and it is also potentially winnable. So those are the 5. Homie Alex 7 on our subreddit also points out there are some longer shots. Like if you look at Georgia, where the Republican is only +5, you could look at Texas. John Cornyn is not super popular. I've said, what if Beto O'Rourke were to abandon the race for the presidential nomination because he has no chance and get down to Texas? Could he defeat John Cornyn? So those are a little more speculative, but this is potentially winnable in 2020. Now, to be thorough, there's one other Democratic seat that is not super safe, and that's Jeanne Shaheen in New Hampshire. The polling is very close. We've got to work on that one as well. We have to hope that the incumbent Democrat will ultimately pull away. So these races require work. And the important thing now, if we want to do a more macro analysis, this is looking at it race by race. The reality is that the general pro or anti-Trump sentiment, pro or anti-Republican sentiment, is likely to have a more general effect. So it's not, if Texas ends up being in play, it's probable that North Carolina is winnable and Iowa is winnable, et cetera. If Trump's popularity goes back up, if Republican attitudes towards Republican incumbents resurge, then it's likely a lot of these will not go our way. But still, if you want to get involved in an individual race, all you can do is work that race. And if you live in any of these states, even if you don't, and you can still phone bank, this one's going to require work. But 2020, the Senate is winnable. Donald Trump's ignoramus staffers really need to stop saying the quiet part out loud for their own benefit. Donald Trump has this total buffoon of an acting chief of staff. Remember, there's no permanent chief of staff right now. The acting chief of staff is Mick Mulvaney. We're going to get into a lot more of this wacky interview he gave yesterday to Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday later on in the program. But I want to get one clip in front of you today where Mick Mulvaney has admitted that Donald Trump, despite being president of the United States, which is a full-time job, by the way, Donald Trump still considers himself to be in the hospitality business as president of the United States, which is effectively an admission that, just like anyone with a brain suspected, Trump is still running his businesses. Trump is still involved in his businesses despite being president of the United States. Mulvaney, among other incredibly dumb things that he said yesterday to Chris Wallace, which I'll get to a little bit later, said Trump Trump is still in the business. The context here is that Trump said he would host the G7 summit at his own Club Doral. Then they made the decision to cancel that because it is, after all, a completely unconstitutional violation of the Emoluments Clause. Here's Mick Mulvaney saying it himself.
He is back. He's decided that he's not going to hold it at Doral. He blames it on, quote, the hostile media and their Democratic partners. But again, he was getting hammered by Republicans. So why did he cave?
We talked about it at great length last night. And it's not lost on me that if we had made the decision on Thursday, we wouldn't have had the press conference on Thursday regarding everything else. But that's fine. But we did talk about it last night. And I honestly think what you saw in the tweet was real. The president isn't one for holding back his feelings and his emotions about something. He was honestly surprised at the level of pushback. At the end of the day, he still considers himself to be in the hospitality business. And he saw an opportunity to take the biggest leaders from around the world, and he wanted to put on the absolute best show, the best visit that he possibly could.
So then Mulvaney filibusters a little bit, but Chris Wallace makes the right decision, and he goes back to, hold on a second, the president of the United States has another vocation. He considers himself to, while president, still be in the hospitality industry?
I just have to pick up. You say he considers himself in the hospitality business. He's the president of the United States.
Yeah. But that's his background. It's like, I used to be in the real estate business. I don't know what you used to do before you were in media, if
Nothing.
anything.
That's all I've ever done.
But he wanted to put on a show.
The right follow-up there would have been when Mick Mulvaney says, well, yeah, I mean, I was in real estate before. Chris Wallace should have said, okay, but now you're the chief of staff, another full-time job of extraordinary importance to the running of our government. Do you still consider yourself today to be in the real estate business? Chris Wallace not following up in that way. And we are going to have a lot more about Mulvaney later on in the program. I believe Mulvaney may be out the door soon. He's going out of his way now to say total nonsense just to defend Donald Trump. And the thing about that is that in the short term, Trump rewards you. When you express this unhinging, unflinching loyalty to Donald Trump in the short term, where you will go on TV and say anything, no matter how ridiculous, to defend Donald Trump, Trump rewards you in the immediate. But then other Republicans start to cringe. The crazy things that the staffer says become a distraction. They become the subject of news coverage on corporate media, both left, right, and center. And that's when then Donald Trump starts to back away. And next thing you know, he says he has full confidence in you. And 48 hours later, that you end up actually being gone. So this may be the beginning of the end for Mick Mulvaney. And after the break, we are going to get into his full interview with Chris Wallace, where Chris Wallace does a very good job of pointing out that Mick Mulvaney is now denying having said things that are on camera. We have recordings. 2019 technology allows us to go back to the tape, so to speak, and look at what it is that you said. So we're going to get back to that. As far as Trump is currently still in the hospitality industry, the progression usually is, no, I never actually said that. Then Chris Wallace shows you a clip of you saying it. Then it's, well, I said it, but I meant it as a joke, or it wasn't literal. Then Trump comes back and says, wait, no, hold on. I am still in the hospitality industry and I'm the best at it, at which point Mulvaney has to flip and say, oh no, okay, yeah, I was serious when I said it, and it's actually fine for the president to both be president of the United States and still be in the hospitality industry. Question to you, is Mulvaney saying Trump is still in the hospitality industry? Do you think that this is stupidity? Or do you think that they are deliberately trolling at this point? What do you believe is going on here? Are they messing with people by saying absolute and total nonsense like this? Or do you think that they are actually this dumb to say the quiet part out loud? Leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube. Send me a tweet at dpackman if you are watching or listening to the program anywhere else. And while you're on Twitter, just a suggestion, follow The David Pakman Show at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Brandon Hanner and Donna Russo. Brandon and Donna, thank you so much for your support. Thanks to everybody who signed up with the huge membership special that we did last week. I think the final count was 179 folks signing up with that membership special last week. If you missed it, we'll probably do one more big one before the end of the year. Also want to say thanks to Michael K. Trapp, who has been with us for almost 5 years and is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Join these great people by signing up in under a minute at www.joinpacman.com. Okay, so I mentioned this before the break. Let's get now to the full embarrassment that was Donald Trump's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace yesterday. This will be something different. We're going to look in detail at an interview. And there is so much to learn from this interview that Chris Wallace did with Trump's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney. I already played for you the short clip in another story of Mick Mulvaney claiming that even though Donald Trump is the president of the United States, that's just one of his gigs, effectively, that Trump still considers himself to be in the hospitality industry. So we won't go back over that. That's ridiculous enough. What was actually far more embarrassing was the way in which Mick Mulvaney came completely unglued, trying to deny directly to Chris Wallace's face, having said things that are on video, which Chris Wallace was prepared for and threw right back at in Mick Mulvaney's face with clips, and it is glorious. Now, you don't often see this in media in the United States in general, and when you do, it's not usually on Fox News, but I believe that we are in such a desperate circumstance when it comes to proper preparation by an interviewer for interviewing someone that you believe is likely to be deceptive, and to be ready not only with video clips, but with facts and quotes and the demeanor to actually question it, that this is what we have and I want to go through it with you. We're going to look at a bunch of this in pieces because not only is the subject matter important, but it's good to be able to parse it. It's good to be able to understand how Chris Wallace structured it. And there's a lot to be learned from this. And the other thing to keep in mind is this is much more common in British news media. This is much more common in, I watch a lot of Argentinian news. This is much more common in Argentinian media, where in the US, very often with people in positions of power, once they give you the same non-answer or lie 2 or 3 times, you just move on. And it's a combination of not wanting to push the interview in a way where you are at risk of maybe losing access to the person or an administration, combined with the time constraints of corporate media. Chris Wallace does not let it go. And you actually expose Mick Mulvaney as the absolutely immoral Trump brown-noser that he is, willing to just tell lie after lie after lie. Let's look at the first clip.
All right, let's have the conversation.
Yeah.
Here's my first question. Why did you say in that briefing that President Trump had ordered a quid pro quo that investigating the Democrats, that aid to Ukraine depended on investigating the Democrats? Why'd you say that?
Again, that's not what I said. That's what people said. That I said, here's what I said. I'll say it again, and hopefully people will listen this time. There were 2 reasons that we held up the aid. We've talked about this at some length. The first one was the rampant corruption in Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, Chris, is so bad in Ukraine that in 2014 Congress passed a law requiring us to make sure that corruption was moving in the right direction. So corruption's a big deal. Everybody knows it. The president was also concerned about whether or not other nations, specifically European nations, were helping with foreign aid to the Ukraine as well. We've talked about that for quite a while now. I did then mention that in the past, the president had mentioned for me to time about the DNC server. He'd mentioned the DNC server to other people publicly. He even mentioned it to President Zelensky in the phone call, but it wasn't connected to the aid, and that's where I think people got sidetracked this weekend at that press conference. 2 reasons for holding back the aid.
Let me pursue that, though.
Sure.
Because I believe that anyone listening to what you said in that briefing could come to only one conclusion. Let's play what you said.
Sure. Did he also mention to me in past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money.
You just described as a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happen as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
He mentioned the corruption, and that's why we held up the money, and we do it all the time. With foreign policy, all the time, we withhold aid for things like this, is what Mick Mulvaney is saying. So Chris Wallace comes back after Mulvaney tries to filibuster for a little while and says, yeah, but hold on, Mick, what about the video where you said it? And Mulvaney immediately starts to come apart.
You were asked specifically by Jonathan Karl, was investigating Democrats one of the conditions for holding up the aid? Was that part of the quid pro quo? And you said it happens all the time.
Yeah, but go back and watch what I said before that. I don't know if you guys can cue it up or not. There was a long answer about corruption and a long answer about
totally said that.
Just like I told you then, and then I said the exact same thing I just said now.
So he starts to just do doublespeak. And a minute later, after again filibustering Chris Wallace, Wallace goes back at him with more clips, which he has prepared. Another moment where Mick Mulvaney said exactly the thing Chris Wallace is accusing him of having said, despite Mulvaney attempting to deny it to Chris Wallace's face.
And, you know, I hate to go through this, but you said what you said. And the fact is, after that exchange with Jonathan Karl, you were asked another time why the aid was held up. What was the condition for the aid? And you didn't mention two conditions. You mentioned three conditions. And and let's listen to all three of them, because you stated it very clearly. Let's listen.
Three issues for that: the corruption in the country, whether or not other countries were participating in the support of the Ukraine, and whether or not they were cooperating in an ongoing investigation with our Department of Justice. That's completely legitimate.
Not only did you say that investigating the Democrats was one of the three conditions, not two, that you had just said that you had talked about, investigating the Democrats was part of the quid pro quo. You also said, if I may, it was part of the Justice Department investigation into the origins of the Russia probe. But
so Wallace keeps going, and to his credit, these officials count on that if you tell the same lie over and over again to corporate media, eventually the interviewer is going to move on, either because they don't want to get in trouble with the administration, or they want to save face, or they're pressed for time, or whatever the case may be. But Chris Wallace is not moving on. Each time Mick Mulvaney looks like more of a liar, which he is.
Look to the facts on the ground, things that you can actually sort of certify. And what should put this issue to bed is that the money flowed without any connection whatsoever to the DNC server.
You, in your first answer, which I gave, you said that's why we held up the money. First, you just said here that it was for two reasons. Now you're acknowledging it was for three reasons. If you held up the money for three reasons, that's a quid pro quo. You got to satisfy us on those. Now, maybe the president backed off that, but that was the proposition here.
No, I'm not acknowledging there's three reasons. Again, let's go back.
You said three reasons.
Go back to I recognize that. Go back to what actually happened in the real world.
I love that. You really have to be careful with these guys because they have media training. Mick Mulvaney knows, at least in terms of demeanor and verbosity, how to talk to corporate media. And to come away sounding like he makes sense, even though he's saying A and then the opposite of A, Mulvaney says, I never said that there were three reasons. And Wallace says, well, you did. I played it for you. And Mulvaney says, I acknowledge that. If you're a casual viewer, you're hearing Mick Mulvaney in a 60-second clip deny that he said there were three reasons for the aid being withheld, and also say, I acknowledge that. Is he saying that he acknowledges having said it, but he misspoke? Is he saying he acknowledges that actually there were three reasons, even though he's out of the other side of his mouth telling you that there were not actually three reasons? What does it mean? It's confusing. What it means is that he's a liar, of course. Then Mulvaney gets to the disastrous phone call transcript, which of course was not a transcript. It was a few plucked paragraphs from the transcript, which was released. Trump released it, thought it made him look great. It actually was an incriminating transcript, in reality, just a truncated summation of the call, excerpts of the call. And now it really starts to go bad for Mick Mulvaney because Chris Wallace was prepared for the phone call discussion.
In the briefing, you flatly denied any connection between holding up the aid and investigating Joe Biden and his son, right?
Correct.
Okay. In his phone call with President Zelensky, however, President Trump specifically mentions the Bidens. Do me a favor. Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani pushed all summer for Ukraine to announce it was investigating Burisma, the company that paid Hunter Biden. And a former NSC official testified this week before Congress. John Bolton was so disturbed by the way you were directing people to work with Rudy Giuliani. He said, quote, I am not part of whatever drug deal, he was speaking metaphorically,
right,
of whatever drug deal Sondland, a U.S. diplomat, and Mulvaney are cooking up. No question, you were following the president's orders, but your fingerprints are all over linking aid to Ukraine with investigating the Bidens.
Okay, no, that's not true. Let's go, I'll take one of those at a time, which is the Bolton thing, because I read that and I was surprised because John Bolton never complained to me about it. No one at NSC ever complained to me about anything that was going on. I didn't see Sondland's testimony this week because none of us have seen Sondland's testimony, which is another story entirely. I did get a chance to read his opening statement when he said that Bolton never complained to him, Fiona Hill never got a chance to complain to him. I think you need to put sort of the...
Wait a minute, Fiona Hill is the one who testified. That's the quote came from her.
Never complained to Sondland about what was happening when it was happening.
No, she complained to her boss, John Bolton.
Who did what?
Who said, who told her to go immediately to a lawyer
right
at the NSC and to complain about it.
Works for John Bolton. Yet John Bolton didn't go say anything to anybody. Doesn't that raise a red flag with it? But let's go back to the first one you talked about, which is the president's phone call. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is really about, right? That's why we're here.
Well, this I don't know about. That I don't agree on. This was mischaracterized. This is another technique, okay? Understand that this is a technique that officials under pressure will often use. It's a sort of Gish Gallop, where instead of answering the crux of the question, instead of getting to the heart of the matter, they give 4 different pseudo-rebuttals to minor points that don't actually refute the substance of what it is that's being discussed, but it appears to the untrained, by that I mean, not in a pejorative way, to just casual news viewers who have lives and go to work and take care of their kids. It appears as though Mick Mulvaney has refuted the narrative that Chris Wallace has presented, when in reality he hasn't. The big picture is Mulvaney is an obvious liar. He's trying to suck up to Trump until Trump turns on him, because Mulvaney will be ridiculed in the same way that Giuliani for a while was pulled off the air because it became too embarrassing. Mulvaney now has been very publicly doing lots of interviews in the wake of the Ukraine fiasco. He may end up getting pulled. Chris Wallace was well prepared here. Chris Wallace was prepared with clips and with knowledge and with quotes, and he does something that I try to do when I interview public officials. When I interview a scientist, I go in with my questions prepared to learn. I want to learn from the scientist. When I interview an elected official, I want to go in anticipating what their answers are going to be to my questions and how they may attempt to either distort or not answer. And that's exactly what Chris Wallace did here. And as prepared as Chris Wallace is, still, when someone like Mulvaney comes in, prepared to filibuster, ready to question minor points in a Gish Gallop format, even an experienced interviewer like Chris Wallace can get thrown off track in the moment. And that's something that, unless you're doing interviews like this, can be difficult to understand how it happens. But overall, very solid. Mulvaney looking like the dishonest Trump brown-noser that he is. And we'll be posting clips from this interview on our Instagram page as well. I hope you'll follow us there at David Pakman on Instagram. While you're in your Instagram app, give me a follow as well at david.pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
So Donald Trump continues to tweet and to say more and more about how he is bringing troops home from Syria. And this has been one of the big defenses and justifications for what is actually A completely short-sighted and haphazard decision to abandon the Kurds in northern Syria, who were immediately attacked by Kurdish forces after American troops pulled back. We're bringing troops home has been the story. Except it turns out that that is also not true. Trump tweeted that the troops are coming home. And then the Pentagon Chief Mark Esper said, well, they're not really coming home. They're going from Syria to Iraq. The troops are actually going to the epicenter of so-called endless war in Iraq. And when you look at the details of the entire situation, it is truly in every sense the worst of American foreign policy. And I'll explain what I mean. We abandoned the Kurds in northern Syria. Okay, so that is a problem. We immediately have the narrative that getting troops out of anywhere at any opportunity is by default the right thing, and we should be praising Trump for it, despite all of the both circumstantial questions about it, foreign policy questions about it, motivational questions about it, blackmail questions about it. I mean, all sorts of questions around Trump's decision. Okay, but we're told we are at least going to get troops out of harm's way. We're going to get out of an endless commitment. That is all good, even if it has some unintended consequences like the deaths of Kurds. Except we quietly kept a small number of forces in northern Syria anyway, not much publicized. What are they doing? Not protecting the Kurds, they're protecting oil fields. Oil fields. Case in point, prototypical of American foreign policy. Abandon the Kurds, protect the oil fields. Okay. But that's not bad enough. Then Mark Esper says, in the same statement where he says a small number of troops are still there protecting oil fields, he says all U.S. troops leaving Syria are going to Western Iraq. No one is coming home. The story is false. The United States is not leaving the region, and it's really important to understand the significance of this. The entire justification for abandoning the Kurds, opening the door to the resurgence of ISIS that we are now dealing with, as the French Prime Minister recently told us. It was all about stopping endless and indefinite military commitments, getting out of the region, taking our troops out of harm's way. The troops are moving from Syria to Iraq. We aren't ending indefinite military commitments. We aren't taking those troops out of harm's way. We're not getting out of the region. We're not doing any of the things that supposedly are good about the decision to leave northern Syria. And we're actually perpetuating many of the problems that some claim Trump is solving by leaving northern Syria. We're shifting troops around. And we're shifting troops around in a way that has led to Kurds being killed, to the pleasure, by the way, of Putin and Erdogan, while not accomplishing any of the outwardly stated goals. This is a microcosm of foreign policy under Donald Trump. It's a combination of everything Trump says is actually the opposite, with not accomplishing the stated goals, never properly analyzing what might actually be a motivating factor, and then in the end, we're actually doing the opposite of what it is that we claim to be doing via these foreign policy decisions. Now, everything Trump says being the opposite is not new. There's many examples of that in the Trump presidency. Trump says he's going to drain the swamp. He has filled the swamp more than any president in recent history. Trump says he knows trade and he's going to do better on trade than anybody else. People fall for it. Then he starts a trade war that he can't win, and he absolutely decimates Midwestern farmers in the United States. He says he will end conflicts of interest with his businesses. He actually has more conflicts of interest than ever. He's funneling millions of dollars into his pockets by virtue of being president, and those pockets of his friends and family. He will be the most transparent president with the most transparent administration. No press briefings since, is it last March? I mean, has it been nearly, 7, 8, 9 months since the last actual press briefing? And of course, bring the troops home and get them out of harm's way and get out of an indefinite conflict and an endless conflict. And it's the opposite. It's we'll send them elsewhere while our allies who have been helping us to fight ISIS, the Kurds, are getting killed. If you don't see the tragedy that this foreign policy and this presidency is, then maybe you deserve this presidency. I'm sort of at a loss for how to even sum it up, but the exact opposite of what we were told is happening is actually what is happening on the ground. And you don't have to go to fake news media to be told it. You just read the words of Trump's own Pentagon Chief Mark Esper. He's telling you what's going on. This is one of those funny stories about the pot calling the kettle black that reflects the total blind hyperpartisanship that is one of the most toxic elements of politics today. Donald Trump Jr. is calling out the Bidens for nepotism. It sounds like satire. It sounds like an Onion article. Now, I don't want to redo this because I've already done it. I've not ignored the totally toxic nature of the political status quo that leads to someone like Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, to have a $50,000 a month consulting contract with a Ukrainian gas company. I did an entire story about this last week or the week before. There is no question that this is exactly the type of thing that is endemic to our political system. It's the revolving door of elected officials and lawyers and lobbyists and consultants, including both themselves and their family members and their significant others. We need to root it out. It's a problem, there is no question. Now, that being said, there was nothing particularly egregious about the Hunter Biden consulting gig in the sense that Trumpists have been arguing, the conspiratorial way. This is the system we have. It's a disgusting system. It's a corrupt system. It has to be changed, but it's business as usual. But then Donald Trump Jr. goes on Twitter and says Biden's career, Hunter Biden's career, is based just on his dad's, and that's bad and that's corrupt. His name is Donald Trump Jr., and he's saying that the name Biden, being a Biden, has put Hunter Biden in a privileged position. Has irony died? Take a look at this video clip from the Sean Hannity program, a very rehearsed Donald Trump Jr. trying to make this case.
When you're the father and your son's entire career is dependent on that, they own you, Sean. That's what it is. They've bought Biden Inc., and they've been doing it both domestically, whether it was MBNA Bank, whether it was Amtrak, whatever it was, domestically when he was a senator and had influence over domestic policy, and they started doing it internationally the second Joe Biden became vice president and had authority abroad.
Donald Trump Jr. is criticizing someone else for having a career built on their name and their father's name. So there are two options here. One is that Don Jr. is genuinely so dumb that he just doesn't realize that his critique of Joe and Hunter Biden is relevant 10 times over about him and Eric Trump and Ivanka Trump in relation to Donald Trump Sr., the president of the United States. That's one possibility. The other possibility is he does get it, but he assumes Sean Hannity's audience and his dad's followers are so dumb that they won't notice the obvious hypocrisy of him, Donald Trump Jr., criticizing Joe and Hunter Biden of nepotism. The funny thing is that this is actually something that Don Jr. is an authority on. You know, I said last week we covered Lara Trump, who's the wife of Eric Trump, being brought onto Fox News to comment on Syria. What does Lara Trump know about Syria and the Kurds? Absolutely nothing. Don Jr. actually is an expert on nepotism and how to use your father's name to get money and speaking gigs and build a career. He's done it. He is the right person to be commenting about it. The problem is he's commenting about it as if it's a problem he's observing rather than something he's an example of. And of course, that irony is not lost on many of the leftists who have seen what has gone on here. Hunter Biden was paid $50,000 a month to consult for a Ukrainian gas company. Is that a gig he would have had if he wasn't Joe Biden's son? Of course not. Of course not. Donald Trump Jr. is making millions from the presidency of his father, is in a privileged and powerful position where he, more Ivanka Trump, they're meeting with world leaders. They're sometimes sitting in for their dad, who is the president of the United States. Would they have that if they weren't Donald Trump's son? Obviously not. And this is a complete lack of self-awareness, made even more cartoonish by the fact that his name is literally the same name as his dad, right? Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, Donald Trump Jr. If having the same last name as a former vice president is lucrative, What about having just literally the same name as the current president of the United States? My question to you is, and I don't know the answer to this, is Don Jr. dumb enough that he doesn't realize the irony of what he's saying? Or is he smart enough to realize it, but he just thinks the people watching Sean Hannity are too stupid to figure it out? Let me know by either commenting on this video on YouTube or by sending me a tweet at dpackman. We will take a quick break and be back after this to talk about the best thing that has ever happened to Tulsi Gabbard, okay? If you've been paying attention to the news over the last few days, maybe you know what it is. It relates to Hillary Clinton. That's coming up next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
This is a very interesting story that we have to talk about. Hillary Clinton decided to go after 2020 Democratic presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard over the weekend. Tulsi Gabbard has fired back, and the most important top-line analysis of this entire story is that this is the best thing to ever happen to Tulsi Gabbard. And I'll explain why. Hillary Clinton did a podcast interview with David Plouffe, who is Barack Obama's former campaign manager. And during this interview, she made a bunch of different claims. She said the Russians are leveraging numerous American politicians. Russia may have compromat, meaning compromising information about Donald Trump. She says she believes that 2016 Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein is a Russian asset. And she suggested that Tulsi Gabbard is backed by Russia and might even be supported by Russia to run third party in 2020, which could potentially spoil the election for the eventual Democratic nominee and help Donald Trump get reelected as president of the United States. Her exact quote is, quote, "They're also going to do third party again. I'm not making any predictions, but I think they've got their eye on someone who's currently in the Democratic primary and are grooming her to be the third-party candidate. She's the favorite of the Russians. They have a bunch of sites and bots and other ways of supporting her so far." So this then sets up Tulsi to fire back at Hillary Clinton in a series of, quite frankly, pretty wacky tweets, but it doesn't even matter at this point because Hillary has stepped in it so severely. Tulsi Gabbard saying, "Great, thank you, Hillary Clinton. You, the queen of warmongers, embodiment of corruption and personification of the rot that has sickened the Democratic Party for so long, have finally come out from behind the curtain. From the day I announced my candidacy, there has been a concerted campaign to destroy my reputation. We wondered who was behind it and why. Now we know. It was always you. Through your proxies and powerful allies in the corporate media and war machine, afraid of the threat I pose, it's now clear that this primary is between you and me. Don't cowardly hide behind your proxies. Join the race directly." The reason that this is wacky is the same reason that Tulsi has been wacky all along, which is that Tulsi Gabbard has been pretending or claiming that the DNC and the establishment are stopping her in the 2020 campaign in the same way that they stopped Bernie in 2016. This is delusional, and I'll explain why momentarily, but the main point is this attack by Hillary against Tulsi is the best thing that has ever happened to her. Tulsi Gabbard has been polling on average between 0.6 and 1.5%. I believe at the latest she was averaging 1.2% in the polls. She never had a shot at securing the nomination. Other than a few moments in debates, she made Tim Ryan look bad in one debate. That's the one that stands out to me. She had a couple of other moments. No traction. Other than, her followers say she gets a lot of web searches after debates, which doesn't seem to be helping her polling at all. She hasn't even made all of the debates. She's got bad takes on a lot of issues. She's dabbling with Republican framing all the time. Check out her recent interview with cultural critic Dave Rubin as an example. And so what Hillary Clinton is doing by attacking Tulsi Gabbard is helping her fundraising, potentially going to help her polling, maybe help her qualify for the 5th debate in November, which she otherwise may not have. As of a few days ago, she had not qualified for it. The tide has been turning more and more against Tulsi Gabbard because she's saying more and more ridiculous things about the Kurds and Syria and Modi and the DNC and Assad. Her bogus grandstanding threat to boycott the 4th debate, which of course she didn't do. It was clear that Tulsi was about to disappear. And in comes Hillary Clinton and revives attention for Tulsi Gabbard. A very dumb move. Now, let me address Tulsi and her followers, framing Tulsi as the screwed candidate of 2020, just like Bernie was screwed in 2016. This is a ridiculous comparison. There are two main differences between Bernie 2016 and Tulsi 2020, and they're not small differences. The differences are public support and progressive change makers, okay? Bernie Sanders polled as high as 47% in 2016. He had gained the support of nearly half of the Democratic primary voters. Tulsi Gabbard has not polled more than, 2 in some polls, 3 maybe in one poll in the entire primary. Tulsi Gabbard does not have and has never had the support that Bernie had in 2016. So to equate the campaigns and to argue that the DNC and establishment have screwed Tulsi just like they screwed Bernie out of the nomination is laughable. And anyone who believes that that is a case that can be made empirically either doesn't know the facts or is deliberately not paying attention to them. That's number one. The second difference between Bernie 2016 and Tulsi 2020 is that Bernie's 2016 campaign was a progressive campaign that actually ran on shaking up the establishment status quo of campaign finance, of healthcare, on a long list of issues that have become progressive mainstream in 2020. Bernie's progressive 2016 candidacy really threatened the establishment and changed the way that Democratic politics is done with the huge growth of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Tulsi is running more and more to the middle. She's not for Medicare for all. She's not clearly even in favor of impeaching Donald Trump, even for the inquiry. She's not clearly for defending the Kurds, and on and on and on. She's running on the repeated slogan, "No more forever wars," in a geopolitical vacuum. There are people who have fallen for that and said that's the progressive hero. That's great. That's progressive. But the idea that her campaign is anything like Bernie's in 2016 in terms of the impact it would have on the establishment and the impact that it has on challenging the status quo is ridiculous. But in the end, thanks, Hillary, Tulsi may now last a little bit longer thanks to this entire thing, and just yet another major, major misstep by Hillary Clinton. Every time we talk about how X or Y scenario is likely to go forward during what is hopefully the last 15 months of Donald Trump's presidency, those analyses assume that Republicans are not going to turn on Donald Trump, that in the end, Republican senators would not vote to impeach Donald Trump, that Trump's Republican cabinet would not use the 25th Amendment to try to remove Trump from power. Those are the assumptions that we're operating under. However, former Trump White House communications director, I think he lasted 10 days, Anthony Scaramucci, has a different perspective. He now says that 20 or more Republicans are set to turn on Donald Trump. This is Scaramucci effectively predicting a sort of Nixon-like scenario from the 1970s. You might remember Republicans went to Nixon in the 70s in the midst of the Watergate fiasco and said, listen, we don't want to impeach you, but we're going to have to if it comes to a vote. So why don't you resign? And that's exactly what Richard Nixon did. Check out Scaramucci on CNN making the case.
Well, he obviously knows a lot more facts about the case are going to unfold over the next, 2 to 6 weeks, Don. And so I think that's got him rattled. And I think he's also looking at the future. The future does not look good for him because as more facts unfold about Syria, as more facts unfold about the people that have been arrested recently and the conjoinment of all those issues over there, it's going to be devastating for the president. And what will ultimately happen, which I predicted on CNN's air 2 months ago, the full-blown meltdown we're experiencing, Speaker Pelosi described it today, But what will eventually happen is the criminal activity will be so great that the GOP, and there'll be 20 plus senators, will say, okay, I can't take this anymore, reminiscent to what Howard Baker and Barry Goldwater did in the 70s, and called Richard Nixon and said, look, no mas, you got to go. And so that will eventually happen, and that's the reason why he's pressurized. But I really wish the White House press would just ask him what was in it for him personally.
So this is just one guy, right? I mean, this is just Anthony Scaramucci. You never want to put too much stock into what any one person says, but this is a narrative that has been floating around for a while. And the idea is actually deeper than 20 Republicans will turn on Trump. The real idea is a whole bunch of Republicans have already turned on Trump in their minds internally. The question is that they are balancing their own political futures with doing what they believe is right, which is turning on Donald Trump. Now, this isn't a great moral realization about Republicans. Republicans who support Trump are immoral and indifferent to supporting so-called conservative values. That's bad enough. Republicans who privately don't support Trump but continue to support him publicly, they are also terrible. They're merely choosing political expediency and calculation for the benefit of their careers over what they actually believe would be good for the country, which is pretty damn bad in a different way. So when we hear Scaramucci say it, he may know what he's talking about, he may not. It'll be interesting to see if and when it happens. But to the extent that this is an existing narrative that we've been following, we just need to watch the polls. Support for impeachment and removal has been climbing. If we believe that there are at least some disgruntled Republican senators out of the 53 that are currently in the Senate, and they're waiting around for public support to be high enough that the risk to their careers is diminished if they come out and say, it is time to remove Donald Trump, we're pretty damn close to getting there. We have support for impeachment and removal hitting and surpassing 50%. In a hyper-polarized modern status quo of American politics, you're not going to get that much more before it becomes tantamount to major support for removing the president of the United States from office. And what we know is that these Republican senators are all about just putting their finger to the wind, trying to end up on the right side of public opinion, conservative so-called values be damned. So we don't even have to put any special stock in what Anthony Scaramucci is saying here. This has been a possibility for a while. We've been considering it for about a year and a half, and we'll follow it. There's a timing issue, though, as we are now only 12 and a half months from the 2020 election, which is if Republicans are going to turn on Trump, they sort of need to do it pretty soon before it's going to be too little too late. We have a voicemail number. That number is 2192-DAVID-P. Here is a question that I'm going to assume is being asked in good faith, but it has been answered so many times. Take a listen.
Hi, David. My name is Luigi. Would you kindly address the tax increase that would probably happen if Sanders or Warren instituted their Medicare for All bill? Probably worded that incorrectly, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, listen, so Elizabeth Warren doesn't have a Medicare for All bill. She said she likes Bernie's, but she's open to other ideas. We don't know exactly how her plan would be funded, although she has said total costs would go down, the rich and corporations would pay more. Okay, let's focus on Bernie's. Bernie has addressed the costs, and I've addressed the costs. Your total cost would go down under Medicare for All. There would be a payroll tax that is added. It would be a couple percentage points to the average worker. Corporations would pay a piece of it as well. Premiums go away, co-pays go away, co-insurance goes away. All of these costs go down, and then you pay a little bit through your payroll tax. If you can't afford it, if you don't have a job, that's okay. The numbers account for that already. This has been addressed. There is a fair criticism that Bernie is not always the most solid in terms of his messaging of how this will work. It's been addressed. The proposal to pay for it is out there. And I'm not criticizing the caller, but lots of people just haven't seen that. To continue to pretend, as some are doing, that the cost element hasn't been addressed or that the tax element hasn't been dealt with, it has. Now, you might not like it. You might disagree with the approach. You could disagree that the numbers have been calculated correctly. Reasonable people can disagree about whether the cost of the program has been properly assessed. That's all very reasonable. But to pretend that Bernie hasn't addressed this time and time again, he has. And it's widely available online, and I encourage you to check it out. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Get instant access to the bonus show by becoming a member at joinpacman.com or a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.